Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and we are still talking about Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. We're playing Rakdos Goad. Everyone gets to fight, except you, Carter, go away. We're playing Karazikar the Tyrant. Now before we get into this deck tech, let's go over a really brief summary of what we'll be talking about today. And you can navigate to whatever part of the video you like using the timestamps. So first, who is Karazikar? Why should you goad all of your opponents into hitting each other? Well, when we say it like that, you should be asking why wouldn't you want to do this? Anyways, we'll go over what our commander does and the general deck strategy. Next, I'll discuss some of the most notable cards in the deck. We've got several different categories of cards. We've got tokens, we've got sacrifice outlets because this is Rakdos. Of course, we'll go over our win conditions. I won't mention every single card in the deck, but we'll discuss a lot of them, and you can always see the link in the description for the full deck list. Then we'll go over the deck stats and costs so you can get a feel for how the deck will play, and maybe some budget considerations you could make for the deck. And then finally I'll go over some alternative commanders you might want to use, and what makes Karazikar unique, or some considerations you might make when building around and playing with this commander. Okay, so let's talk about Karazikar the Tyrant. This is a 5/5 beholder, or in other words a tentacled one-eyed thing from Dungeons & Dragons, I think. It costs 3 black-red, and it has, whenever you attack a player, tap target creature that player controls, and goad it. And goad just means, until your next turn, that creature attacks each combat if able, and attacks a player other than you if able. Karazikar also has, whenever an opponent attacks one of your other opponents, you and the attacking player each draw a card and lose 1 life. So Karazikar obviously wants her opponents to attack each other, and it helps make that happen by goading them. But there's actually a lot on this card. Let's break it all down. First, whenever you attack a player, you get to tap target creature that player controls. So with Karazikar around, you're going to be harder to block. You get to basically pick the toughest creature your opponent has and tap it so it can't block. And this triggers whenever you attack a player, so it doesn't matter which creature you attack with, it doesn't have to be Karazikar. Secondly, of course, you goad that tapped creature, and since this ability triggers once for each player you attack, you'll be able to tap and goad one of each of your opponent's creatures each combat. And again, those goaded creatures have to attack until your next turn, and they can't attack you unless there are no other options. But Karazikar's second triggered ability is really awesome too. Whenever an opponent attacks one of your other opponents, you and that attacking player each draw a card and lose 1 life. And that includes creatures that you didn't goad. Anytime one or more creatures you don't control attack someone other than you, you draw a card. And so does that creature's controller. The wording is confusing, but in a typical 4-player game, you could draw up to 6 cards off of Karazikar for each round of the table, if each opponent attacks each other opponent each combat. And each of your opponents will be incentivized to do so, because they could draw up to 2 cards, again, by attacking each of your other opponents. This is not counting any extra combats, by the way. So this is insane card advantage for everyone, but especially for you. And because you're goading, you'll often be able to draw at least 3 cards per round of the table from Karazikar if you can manage to goad a creature controlled by each opponent. And remember again, your opponents just have to attack each other to trigger this effect. You don't even need to goad them. They might just choose to attack to get that card draw. So again, Karazikar has a lot that it can do, but how do we best take advantage of it? Well, we want to be attacking each turn. Ideally, we want to attack each player each turn, because that's how we goad. Goading essentially damages our opponents, a bit chaotically, essentially by making them attack each other, and with Karazikar, it draws us cards. So we'll need lots of creatures. I've focused on hasty, expendable creatures that can get in and just goad something, even if it doesn't do a lot of damage, even if the creature dies, whatever. We just want to goad things. As long as we're creating tokens, we'll use your Garden Variety Aristocrats engines to gain value when our tokens die. And also, as long as we're playing with tokens, we'll use sacrifice outlets to make sure reliably that our tokens get to die, even if they manage to survive combat. So, just like every other Rakdos deck. Of course, Karazikar rewards us with card draw when our opponents attack each other, but it only goads a few creatures at a time. So we'll include a few other goad effects to help keep our opponents swinging at each other and keep the card draw flowing. So that's the general strategy. We'll win by forcing our opponents to smack each other instead of us, coupled with draining effects from our Aristocrats package, and whatever damage we manage to do in combat as well. So let's talk about the cards in the deck, starting with the tokens. So we want as many tokens as we can get, preferably tokens with haste, then we can attack our opponents right away and start goading with Karazikar. And we don't mind if those tokens die, actually we probably prefer that they do. Legion Warboss, Goblin Rabblemaster, these are 3-mana 2/2s that generate a 1/1 Goblin creature token with haste at the beginning of our combat step. That token has to attack this turn, and it'll probably die, but that's fine, it'll do its job. Goblin Assault is similar, but it's an enchantment, so it'll be harder to remove. It creates a 1/1 Goblin token with haste at the beginning of your upkeep, and it forces all goblins to attack each turn if able. That includes your opponent's goblins, if that matters. Loyal Apprentice makes a 1/1 Hasty Thopter token for you at the beginning of your combat phase, as long as you control your commander, so this is great. But we can make hasty tokens even faster too. Chandra Acolyte of Flame is a 3-mana planeswalker with a 0 ability that makes 2 1/1 red elemental creature tokens with haste. You have to exile them at the beginning of the next end step, so make sure to sacrifice them first if you can, if they survive combat, of course. There's also Chandra Flamecaller. This is a 6-mana Chandra with a +1 that makes 2 3/1 elementals with haste. Again, exile them at the end of the turn. But we can make even more hasty tokens than that. Elemental Mastery is a 4-mana aura that enchants a creature, and you can tap that creature to put X 1/1 elemental creature tokens with haste into play, where X is that creature's power. You exile those tokens at the end of the turn. This aura fits perfectly onto Karazikar because he'll generate 5 elementals. That's more than enough to get that goad trigger on each of your opponents, unless you like to play 12-player commander games, you sicko. Now we like hasty tokens, but we have plenty of other ways to make tokens, even if those tokens don't have haste. Mardu Strike Leader makes a 2/1 warrior token whenever it attacks. Dreadhorde Invasion creates an army token for you each turn. Or, well, it puts a +1/+1 counter on an army token if you already got one. Care Keep is a land that lets you pay 1 in red and tap it to make a 0/1 kobold token. We don't care if our token has 0 power, it just has to attack. Rite of Belzenlock is a saga that makes 5 tokens for you over the course of 3 turns. And there's Scampering Scorcher. This is 3 bodies with haste for 4 mana. We can even use combat to make more tokens. Curse of Disturbance enchants a player, and whenever a player attacks the enchanted player, you make a 2/2 zombie token, and so does the player that's attacking the enchanted player, if it isn't you. But I really like the new Death Tyrant. This is a 5-mana 4/6 Beholder Skeleton with Menace, and it has whenever an attacking creature you control dies, which should happen all the time, or a blocking creature an opponent controls dies, which might happen a lot too, you get to make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This is dumb. You send your dorks in, and they die, and they just turn into more dorks. So Death Tyrant makes zombie tokens, and even when those tokens die by attacking, the Death Tyrant makes more tokens. This is really awesome. And if your opponents kill Death Tyrant, as they should, then you can pay 5 and a black to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This card is pretty cool, at least in this deck. And finally we've got Tillinali's Summoner. This is a 2-mana 1/1 with Ascend. When it attacks, you can pay X and a red to make X 1/1 elemental creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. If you don't have the City's Blessing, you exile those tokens at the end of the turn. Now I want to point out that the tokens created by Tillinali's Summoner will not trigger Karazikar's Goad effect because they're never declared as attackers. They come into the battlefield already attacking. But if you've got the City's Blessing, which is very easy to do, some of them might survive combat and the end of the turn because they won't get exiled, and then they can trigger Karazikar next turn. So this is still okay. And either way, if you've got a lot of Aristocrats effects going around, those tokens can still die for your benefit. So I think Tillinali's Summoner is still useful here. So those are our token generators. Now let's talk about our Aristocrats plan. As long as we're making all of these tokens, we'll use Aristocrats cards to help us gain further advantage. So here I'll cover 3 roles that these cards play. First, we have cards that give us value from creating or killing our own creatures. Second, we have cards that let us sacrifice creatures to trigger our Aristocrat effects. And third, we have effects that gain life for us, and this helps us survive Karazikar's second triggered ability that has us drawing a card and losing a life whenever an opponent attacks another opponent. Because that ability isn't optional, and that life loss will start to add up eventually. So we'll run our typical aristocrat payoffs. Cards like Zulaport Cutthroat and Bastion of Remembrance cause each opponent to lose 1 life, and we gain 1 life whenever one of our creatures dies. There's several effects like this, and we're playing a few more in this deck. I'm not going to read them all here, but you can check out the link to the deck list in the description if you want to see the specific ones I've chosen to include here. Now when it comes to sacrifice outlets, there's 2 things I like to see. Free and capable of attacking to trigger Karazikar. Yahenni Undying Partisan, Falconwrath Aristocrat, and Immersturm Predator are all awesome. Each of these guys can sacrifice creatures for you for free, and when they do, they get indestructible until end of turn, so they're hard to remove. Yahenni and Falconwrath Aristocrat also have haste, and the Aristocrat has flying, so it's easier to get in for damage when it attacks. And I've already spoken highly of Immersturm Predator. This is a free sacrifice outlet that flies, gets bigger, gets indestructible, and hates on graveyards all at the same time. This card is amazing. But we have other sacrifice outlets too. Skullport Merchant and Vampiric Rites each let us pay 1 and a black and sacrifice a creature to draw a card. Krav the Unredeemed lets us pay black and sacrifice X creatures to draw X cards, gain X life, and put X +1/+1 counters on Krav, so that's pretty awesome. When it comes to life gain, we'll use Deathgrader and Sylvok Lifestaff. Deathgrader is a 1/1 that gains us 1 life whenever another creature dies, and Sylvok Lifestaff is an equipment that equips for 1, gives the equipped creature +1/+0, and then we gain 3 life when the equipped creature dies. So again, these are just helping keep us alive as we lose life and draw cards with Karazikar's triggered ability, or just, take any other damage throughout the game. We have other life gain cards in the deck too, but most of them have other functions as well. So again, we have these Aristocrats cards, sack outlets, life gain cards, and a lot of these effects are intertwined. Titan Hunter, for example, is a sacrifice outlet, life gain, and possibly damage to our opponents all in one. It's a 5-mana 4/5. At the end of each player's turn, it deals 4 damage to that player unless a creature died this turn. But it also lets you pay 1 and a black and sack a creature to gain 4 life. Now we won't reliably be dealing 4 damage to each player on their turn, but it will happen, and Titan Hunter helps us gain life too. Lamphead of Death's Vigil is somewhat similar. It just lets you pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life, and each opponent loses 1 life. Again, life drain, draining your opponents, and a sacrifice outlet all in one. So that's our standard aristocrat stuff. Now let's talk about some of the other miscellaneous cards in the deck. Okay, so let's talk about some of our supporting cards in the deck, like our ramp, lands, and removal. First, we love goading our opponents, but we can't always rely on Karazikar to do it for us, so we'll play some redundancy. Let's start with Carter Doomscourge. This is a 4/3 legendary demon. Effectively, it goads all of your opponents when it enters the battlefield. This is a great single-use board-wide goad effect, but Carter also causes each opponent to lose 1 life and you gain 1 life whenever an attacking creature dies. You can attack with creatures and then just sacrifice them to trigger Carter's second ability, which is great. Of course, you could also easily swap out Karazikar for Carter to lead the deck, but we'll talk more about that later. Like Carter, you could also play Disrupt Decorum, a 4-mana sorcery that goads all creatures you don't control. I'm not running Disrupt Decorum in this deck, but I wanted to mention it because it fits perfectly. There's also Geode Rager, a 6-mana 4/3 with first strike and landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, goad each creature target player controls. We also have smaller, more permanent goad effects. Bloodthirsty Blade is an equipment that you can only attach to your opponent's creatures, and it goads the equipped creature. Parasitic Impetus and Shiny Impetus are auras that also goad the enchanted creature. You can use these to point an opponent's threatening beastie somewhere else, or just power up your own creatures if you really need to. When it comes to card draw, we've already mentioned a lot of the sacrifice-based draw effects, but there's also Plumb the Forbidden, a 2-mana instant that lets you basically sacrifice any number of creatures to draw that many +1 cards and lose that much +1 life. This is a great way to respond to a board wipe and fill up your hand. There's Idol of Oblivion. This is a 2-mana artifact that you can tap and draw a card if you had a token enter the battlefield this turn. And of course, Skull Clamp. Enough said. For ramp, I want to use creatures, because Mana Dorks can help us attack and trigger Karazikar if we need to. So we'll use Iron Mirror, Leaden Mirror, and the newer Ornithopter of Paradise, which flies, so it might just survive combat. I also like the new Ebony Fly, a 2-mana rock that can become a variable-sized flyer for 4 mana, and when it attacks it gives another one of your attacking creatures flying, so this is a really great mana rock. There's Curse of Opulence. This is a 1-mana aura that enchants a player, and whenever the enchanted player is attacked, the attacking player, and you, create a treasure token. This is super efficient ramp, and it's just another piece that helps encourage your opponents to attack each other. And then we'll use Impulsive Pilferer. This is a 1/1 goblin that costs 1, and when it dies, you make a treasure. But it also has Encore. You can pay 3 and a red and exile it from your graveyard to make a token copy of it for each opponent. Those tokens have haste and have to attack that opponent this turn if able, then you sacrifice the tokens at the end of the turn. So we can Encore Impulsive Pilferer from our graveyard to get even more Karazikar Goad triggers, more creatures to sacrifice to aristocrat effects, and more treasures. When it comes to removal, most of our selection is pretty standard for black and red, but I'll point out a few specific cards. Necrotic Hex is a great, almost board wipe that gives us tokens. It's a 7-mana sorcery that makes each player sacrifice 6 creatures, but then you get to make 6 2/2 zombie tokens. There's also Warping Whale. This is an instant that costs 1 colorless mana and 1 generic mana, and it has 3 modes. You exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less, or you counter target sorcery spell, or you create a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token. First of all, I love playing counterspells in decks that don't have blue, because my opponents just don't expect them. But that's not quite enough reason to justify Warping Whale, since it can only counter sorceries. However, sometimes we just need another body to attack with and trigger Karazikar's Goad effect, and Warping Whale can do this for us at instant speed by making that 1/1 Eldrazi Scion token. The first ability, which lets us exile a small creature, can be useful too here and there. It's not necessarily reliable, but I think we have at least 2 reasonable modes on this card, and possibly a third, so I do like this spell here. We're running Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, mostly to protect Karazikar because our commander costs 5 mana, which isn't really expensive, but it isn't cheap either, and it does need to stick around on the battlefield to provide value. And then finally, let's talk about lands. I've got a selection of utility lands that can all be fetched out with Expedition Map if there's something specific we need. First, there's the classic Bojuka Bog. We also have High Market, which lets us tap it and sacrifice a creature to gain 1 life, so it's another sacrifice outlet. There's Detection Tower, which lets us pay 1 and tap it, and until your next turn, your opponents and creatures your opponents control that have hexproof can be the target of spells and abilities you control, as though they didn't have hexproof. So Karazikar's Goad ability is targeted, and Detection Tower will let us goad our opponent's creatures that are protected under Swiftfoot Boots and the like. Or of course, if we just want to cast a removal spell on something that's hexproof, we can do that too. There's Hive of the Eye Tyrant, which can be turned into a 3/3 creature with menace by paying 3 and a black, and when it attacks you get to exile a card from defending player's graveyard. And then there's Reliquary Tower, because we can draw a lot of cards with Karazikar, and sometimes it's nice not to have to discard. And we can't fetch it with Expedition Map, but we'll also play Songmad Treachery. This is an MDFC land that taps for red, but the front side of the card is a 5-mana sorcery that lets you gain control of target creature until end of turn. With all of our sacrifice outlets, this is basically a kill spell if we need it. So that is Karazikar the Eye Tyrant. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. Our Karazikar the Eye Tyrant deck has an average mana value of a nice, somewhat speedy 2.79. We have 35 lands, we have 27 creatures, and 15 cards that make creature tokens. Outside of our commander, there are 6 Goad effects in this deck, and we have 9 sacrifice outlets. There are 7 cards that could fit the definition of an aristocrat payoff. Those are cards that drain our opponents when a creature dies. I'm also including Impact Tremors, which instead gives us value by damaging each opponent when we have a creature enter the battlefield, which is fairly similar in this deck. And situational effects like Carter Doomscourge that only give us value by draining our opponents when an attacking creature dies. We have 11 ramp cards and 7 card draw spells, not counting our commander. Karazikar can draw so many cards for us that I'm comfortable with only 7 draw spells in the deck, and most of our draw effects are repeatable, so we'll get consistent card draw from them throughout the game if we need to. And we have 10 pieces of single target removal and 3.5 board wipes. I'm counting Vona's Hunger as half of a board wipe because, well, it kills half of your opponent's creatures, if you have the City's Blessing. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $136.11 on TCGplayer.com. And that is the deck stats and cost. Let's go over what it's like to play with Karazikar in your command zone. Okay, so Karazikar is a lot of fun. Anytime you play around with the Goad mechanic, you'll force your opponents into combat with their utility creatures that would otherwise just sit around providing value, gumming up the battlefield, and slowing down the game. Now, I took this deck into a Tokens and Aristocrat sub-theme. I also tried Attack Matters cards like Cavalcade of Calamity and Raid Bombardment. These are enchantments that cause your attacking creatures to do 1 damage to the player or planeswalker they're attacking, as long as those creatures have power 1 or less for Cavalcade, or power 2 or less for Raid Bombardment. And many of our creatures, our tokens anyways, do have 2 or less power, mostly 1 or less power. I tried these fun combat encouraging cards like Frontier Warmonger, which gives all attacking creatures menace, as long as those creatures aren't attacking you. Or Frenzied Saddlebird, which lets all creatures attack as though they had haste, again as long as those creatures aren't attacking you. I even tried effects like Cataract Parasite and Underworld Dreams, which deal 1 damage to an opponent whenever they draw a card, because Karazikar gives our opponents card draw. Ultimately, I found that all of these strategies just weren't as effective as going for more tokens or more aristocrat payoffs. Raid Bombardment and Underworld Dreams, effects like these just ended up doing very unimpressive amounts of damage compared to something like Blood Artist. Something like Frontier Warmonger is fine, but most of the time I'd rather just have redundancies and token makers. Now you could also consider playing around with extra combats, because each time you attack, you get to goad another creature. Extra combats can also help you just push out more combat damage at your opponents. I didn't go this route, but you might consider it if you like extra combat phases. So Karazikar is a lot of fun. It's a somewhat chaos-oriented Rakdos Goad commander, and we have to make the obvious comparison to Carter Doomscourge. I've played a lot with Carter. I have a Carter Doomscourge deck in paper, and a deck tech video too, so check that out if you're interested. Now Carter goads each creature your opponents control when it enters the battlefield. It also causes each opponent to lose 1 life, and you gain 1 life whenever an attacking creature dies. Now when it comes to goading your opponents, Carter wins hands down. Karazikar only guards a single creature controlled by each opponent per turn, under the best of circumstances. When you build a Carter deck, on the other hand, you're constantly sacrificing and recurring your commander to get its enter the battlefield effect, maybe even every single turn. Your opponents will literally be unable to attack you, ever, until there's only a single opponent left, of course, and then Goad becomes a lot less useful. So Carter is actually very defensive. If your opponents require combat to win, you'll be pretty hard for them to interact with. Karazikar, on the other hand, can't defend you too much against go-wide strategies, like token decks, since it only lets you goad up to 1 creature controlled by each opponent at a time. Nonetheless, I found Karazikar to be very effective, and even more fun than Carter. First, Karazikar is more aggressive. It likes to have you attack, and it taps down a creature when you attack, so it's harder for your opponents to block. And when you're playing with Carter, a lot of your resources, both cards and mana, might be spent sacrificing and recurring your commander to get that goad trigger over and over. You'll be goading your opponents all day, but you might not be doing much else. Karazikar, on the other hand, has the second ability that will keep your hand filled, so you'll be able to cast more spells and do more things. I don't think Karazikar is better than Carter, it's just different. It wants to attack a lot more, but it has poorer defenses. But I do think Karazikar is more fun than Carter, and I will definitely be converting my paper Carter deck into a Karazikar deck. And unlike a lot of combat-focused decks, Karazikar can be fun for other players too. You're actually rewarded for attacking everyone equally when you play this deck, rather than just focusing down 1 player at a time. That way Karazikar gives you more goad triggers and more card draw. And since you're playing a Goad deck, you kind of want to knock out all the other players at the table at about the same time. You don't want to get into an extended 1 versus 1 situation, because then your deck gets weaker as your Goad abilities will be less effective. And you won't get that card draw from Karazikar at all. So again, you're rewarded for attacking everyone equally, which I think is a lot more fun for everyone at the table than if you just knock out one player early on. So that is Karazikar the Eye Tyrant, and that is all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this podcast, you know what to do, like and subscribe and all of that. Let me know in the comments if there's any commanders or mechanics from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, or older cards and sets too, that you'd like to see an unconventional commander deck built around. I think I've exhausted the Adventures in the Forgotten Realms commanders that I've considered for now, that I'd likely build deck techs for, so we'll probably move on to other things until we start getting significant Innistrad spoilers, that is. But again, that is all I've got for today. Thank you for watching.